It's the weekend today, so let's talk about something light. Last week, United States President Biden said at a fundraising event that China's President Xi Jinping is a dictator. This statement sparked a lot of public debate. His remarks weren't specifically targeting Xi Jinping. He was talking about a recent incident where a Chinese balloon drifted into United States airspace. And then Biden said that Xi is a dictator. He couldn't obtain accurate information. He didn't even know about the balloon, let alone what was on it. He was merely trying to highlight the isolation of being a dictator, as a key characteristic of a dictator is that no one dares to tell them the truth. However, during his formal speech, he did call Xi Jinping a dictator. As soon as he said this, China immediately reacted, and the Chinese embassy in the United States issued a statement. They lodged a serious protest and negotiation with the United States government, stating that the United States' accusations are nonsense and unacceptable. Furthermore, they mentioned that any potential political consequences in the future would need to be the responsibility of the United States.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Mao Ning was also tasked with specifically addressing President Biden. The U.S. remarks are extremely absurd, highly irresponsible, seriously contrary to basic facts, severely violate diplomatic etiquette, and gravely infringe on China's political dignity, constituting an open political provocation. China is extremely dissatisfied and firmly opposes this. However, there is an interesting detail that I noticed.
Regarding Mao Ning's speech, first of all, I couldn't see the question. I don't know if it was a question from a foreign journalist, whether he spoke proactively, or if the question was cut out. Secondly, Mao Ning's speech was not reported in domestic media, which is customary. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson's responses to foreign journalists' questions are usually disseminated again in Chinese media in written form, as part of media coverage. But this part was deleted. Why was it deleted? To be honest, it's quite interesting. The thing is, Biden's accusation that Xi Jinping is a dictator cannot be repeated. I've mentioned many times before that in a system like China's, some things simply cannot be repeated, even if you oppose them. So China's media now does not want the Chinese public to know that Biden accused China's President Xi Jinping of being a dictator. Even if you firmly oppose and protest, this is not allowed. Why? Because there are two factors to consider. First, domestically, it is often said that Xi Jinping is not only loved by the Chinese people, but also by people around the world. For example, reference news often talks about how Xi Jinping has pointed out the direction for the future development of China-United States relations. He has pointed the way for the future development of humanity, for the development of China's relations, and for humanity's exploration of outer space. What does this imply? It means that Xi Jinping is not only adored by the Chinese people, but also greatly admired, worshipped and respected by people around the world. So he is an extraordinary leader, and President Xi is truly remarkable. So how is his overall work evaluated? President Xi is just...
It was very fine, but there was a wave of heat. We were all still not much, but I felt that the heat wave was very hot, and it was so exciting that it felt like it was about to burst out at that moment.
Secondly, if the Chinese public were to find out that the United States president accused Xi Jinping of being a dictator, then the Chinese people might really start to think, is Xi Jinping actually a dictator? Because if we don't talk about this issue, no one will really consider it. Of course, it's possible that some people might think about it, but at the very least, calling him a dictator will remind everyone to think about this issue, and that's not acceptable. So did you notice? Chinese media didn't report anything about this news, and even the online nationalists didn't come out to criticize President Biden. I believe that if any of those nationalists on Sina Weibo were to criticize President Biden, saying that President Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator, I estimate that their account might not be safe and could get banned. If you don't believe me, some of you nationalists can try it out. After watching our director Wang's show, you can go on Sina Weibo and try saying, "We firmly protest President Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator, and we absolutely do not agree." Just repeat the words of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson and your account might be gone. Just like that. But why is Biden's remark worth analyzing? It's because this is the first time a sitting United States president has accused China's national leader of being a dictator. Historically, even during the time of Mao, who was very dictatorial, no sitting United States president called him a dictator. This involves a basic issue of diplomatic etiquette. although some leaders of certain countries are known to be asterisk asterisk or thugs, it is generally rare for their counterparts to openly call them thugs on the international stage. Take Kim Jong-un, for example. Everyone knows he is definitely a dictator, but the United States president wouldn't just say in a press conference that Kim Jong-un is a big dictator or a thug. He wouldn't speak like that, because after all, you need to leave some room for future interactions. What if one day President Trump shakes hands with Kim Jong-un? If you've already called him a dictator, it would be awkward to meet, right? So, generally speaking, diplomatic etiquette doesn't involve speaking in such terms, even though sometimes you truly believe it in your heart. It's like when Ceausescu visited the United Kingdom back in the day, because at that time the UK needed something from Romania and hoped he would buy some airplanes or something. The UK, do you still not think that the 7th parameter library is a dictator? Of course he knows, but he won't say it. He even hosts state banquets for him and greets them with a smile. He later recalled that the Ceausescu couple was strolling around Buckingham Palace. And what about the Queen of England? She happened to be walking her dog at the time. When she saw them coming, she didn't want to interact with them, so she took her dog and hid in the woods. That's all. He also couldn't possibly say in a diplomatic setting that the 713 school is this dictator. So why did Biden say that? We are not very good at analyzing this matter, but it has indeed attracted very widespread attention in international public opinion. The Prime Minister of New Zealand said, "I disagree with President Biden's remarks." Why? Because he is scheduled to visit China next week. If he agreed with Biden's comments, how could he visit China? So, New Zealand said, that Xi Jinping is not a dictator, and that China's system is the business of the Chinese people. If they want to change it, they will. If they don't, we don't need to be concerned. This is a normal reaction from most countries. Then the White House responded.
Too bashful about speaking plainly about some of the concerns and issues that we have with the PRC and the challenges that they pose and the president, is very forthright in the way he addresses those challenges and the complicated nature of this relationship.
Oh my, he also said it when facing questions from reporters.
We had an incident that caused some confusion, you might say, but President Secretary Blinken had a great trip to China. I expect to be meeting with President Xi sometime in the future, in the near term, and I don't think it's had any real consequence.
When Biden meets with Xi Jinping, will he say, "Hey buddy, I think you're a dictator, but let's still work on improving our relationship in the future"? So, today, I want to discuss this topic and analyze whether Xi Jinping is indeed a dictator, because this question is actually of great concern to many people in China. Here, we first need to analyze what is meant by a dictator from a political science perspective. A dictator refers to an individual who holds all political power in a country, and this power is absolute and unrestrained. Generally speaking, we refer to such a person as a dictator. There are a few concepts closely related to a dictator, one of which is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism means that in the political system of a country it is not democratic, it cannot share power, and it is monopolized by a certain political party, group, or family. So, within this system, it is possible for one person to hold power, or it could be a group of people holding power. This is called authoritarianism. Then there are examples of authoritarianism, like in Singapore. We refer to it as an authoritarian regime. It conducts democratic elections, but in reality, the People's Action Party has been in power for a long time, and the opposition parties face some suppression in that country. This is a state that contrasts with a democratic system. Generally speaking, we consider China's system to be similar to this. The Chinese Communist Party system is an authoritarian regime, and there is almost no doubt about this, because it does not allow other political parties to share power with it, nor does it allow the people to constrain and supervise them through a normal system. This power is basically absolute. But are all the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party dictators? I think this question is not so certain. For example, Chairman Mao, everyone knows he definitely counts as a dictator.
How did we calculate it? Three new rookies.
Deng count as a dictator? I think most people might find this question debatable. In my own view, I don't think Deng Xiaoping should be considered a dictator. As for Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, I think it's even less likely to consider them as dictators. Of course, some people might still think they are dictators, arguing that as long as they are part of the Chinese Communist Party, how could they not be dictators, right? Then we come to Xi Jinping, and we need to determine whether he is a dictator or not. First, let me outline the historical context. I call old Mao a dictator because Mao, during the 30 years of Mao Zedong's rule over China, all political power was concentrated in his hands. Mao reached the pinnacle of power at the 7th Congress. During the Yan'an period, and later in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party took control of the entire country, and thus the entire governance of China fell into the hands of Mao Zedong personally. In fact, the so-called Advisory Council at that time, as well as the State Council and the internal party system, were all insignificant in the face of that conflicting power. Liu Shaoqi once served as the president of the country, but can you even compare Liu Shaoqi's political power to Mao Zedong's? Not even close. If you look at the memoirs written back then, on the eve of the Cultural Revolution, Mao once had a birthday celebration in the Great Hall of the People. At that banquet, there were a couple of Mao Zedong's female companions, Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Zhennan. At that time, old Mao was very dissatisfied with Liu Shaoqi. During that birthday banquet, old Mao started to angrily lash out at Liu Shaoqi. Later, people recalled that during the meeting, no one dared to speak, including Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai. After attending that banquet, Liu Shaoqi went back and told Deng Xiaoping that he felt extremely endangered. In other words, old Mao, compared to these people within the party, actually had a monarch-subject relationship, rather than the comrade relationship they claimed. For instance, Mao Zedong often didn't attend or oversee Politburo meetings for years, right? After Wang Hongwen started holding Politburo meetings, he would go to Changsha to report to old Mao. Even when in Beijing, it was Mao Yuanxin who represented Mao Zedong at Politburo meetings, and then reported back to him. Of course, this was after the Cultural Revolution. After the founding of the country, Mao's power gradually increased. Repeated political movements. What was the purpose of political purges? A very important task was to eliminate those political figures who could potentially threaten Mao Zedong's political power. Just after the founding of the country, why were Gaogang and Rao Shushi dealt with? Because Gaogang had a close relationship with the Soviet Union at the time and informed Stalin of some information from the CCP meetings. After Mao Zedong found out, he dealt with Gaogang. And what about Gaogang? At that time in the Northeast, he was the chairman of the People's Government, right? Some people would shout, "Long live Chairman Mao," but also wish Gaogang eternal health. When old Mao saw that, he thought, how can that be allowed? So anyone who tried to challenge Mao Zedong's personal authority had to be purged. During the Great Leap Forward, millions of people starved to death across the country. Peng Dehuai saw the starving people and tried to criticize Mao Zedong's erroneous policies at the Lushan Conference. What was the outcome? All these people were labeled as a counter-revolutionary group. It reached its peak during the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong became a god, no longer a mere human. All decisions in the country depended on his series of very arbitrary actions, one after another. So Mao himself was a despot. I think there's no doubt about that. After the reform and opening up, Deng Xiaoping came to power. Deng, I should say, was one of the biggest victims of Mao Zedong's feudal patriarchal system. Of course, it wasn't just him. It also included other people within the party like Chen Yun, Li Xianyan, and Ye Jianying. They all suffered greatly under Mao Zedong's feudal patriarchal control methods. So Deng proposed to abolish the lifelong tenure system for leading cadres. To implement this, collective leadership, needs to turn the Politburo back into a collective decision-making mechanism of the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's 9 people or 7 people. When it comes to major issues, these people should vote on decisions rather than having one person call the shots. So after this system was established, in my opinion, it became very difficult to define subsequent political leaders as absolute dictators. Let's not talk about Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, but even Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were actually constrained by other forces within the party. Especially during Hu Jintao's era, it was referred to as 9 dragons managing the water. What does 9 dragons managing the water mean? It means that the 9 members of the standing committee each managed their own area, and within that area their word was final. Others actually did not have the right to interfere arbitrarily. During the Bo Xilai incident, there was a detail. After Wang Lijun fled to the US consulate, the Politburo Standing Committee held a meeting, right? At that time, they were discussing how to handle Bo Xilai. It is said that some standing committee members initially thought that Wang Lijun should be dealt with, but Bo Xilai should be retained. However, Wen Jiabao and Xi Jinping firmly disagreed, believing that Bo Xilai should also be resolutely removed. In the end, the result of the vote was that this faction prevailed. When I read this detail, I felt that the decision-making system of the Communist Party's high level at that time was still a collective decision-making process, not one where a single person had absolute authority. Therefore, I believe that neither Hu Jintao nor Jiang Zemin can be simply defined as dictators. He is a very peculiar figure, being one of the collective leaders within a dictatorial system. Of course, he also had more power than the average person, and more power than others. But his power was not absolute. There were still some checks and balances within the party. However, with Xi Jinping, we have seen this situation gradually change. Over the past 10 years, he has essentially undermined the basic rules of the country's system. For example, the term limit system. Deng Xiaoping abolished the lifelong tenure system for leading cadres, but Xi Jinping reinstated it by amending the constitution. The rule of serving consecutive terms has also been broken. We don't know how many more years he will continue to serve in the future, right? More importantly, the tradition of the Communist Party appointing successors across generations has also been abolished by him. Other factions within the party no longer exist. For example, in the past, there was the Tuanpai Youth League faction, and the dynamics formed between the Tuanpai and the local power faction. The situation of alternating governance, alas, such a so-called tradition no longer exists. How many terms do you think President Xi Jinping should serve after 5 years? Will this be for life? Will he govern for life? How many terms do you think he should serve? And do you think there are effective mechanisms to supervise and restrain this power, including President Xi Jinping's power? That's right. On the other hand, you can see that Xi Jinping now holds all the power within the party, with no other forces able to constrain him. More importantly, you can see that it is constantly deifying itself through personal cult. Some time ago, I talked about how Xi Jinping has published many works, right? Xi Jinping's The Governance of China, and selected readings of Xi Jinping's works. This approach is actually a way to mythologize Xi Jinping through personal cult. Do you think Xi Jinping has great literary talent? Do his works contain profound truths? Not really. It's through this brainwashing method that people are continuously made to accept it. Xi Jinping is an absolute authority. You are not allowed to discuss him casually, and you are certainly not allowed to question him freely. Back in the day, Mao Zedong used the little red book of Mao's quotations to continuously brainwash people. Is Xi Jinping doing the same thing now? So, from my personal perspective, if you ask whether Xi is a dictator, I would say yes, he is a dictator. Those who agree, please raise your hand. If you disagree, please raise your hand. No, 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 what? No, 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 it did not pass. But this Xi as a dictator indeed brings a great deal of uncertainty to Chinese society. First of all, the unrestrained power makes it easy for him to make very significant mistakes. In his decisions, just think, if it weren't for Mao Zedong's absolute dictatorship back then, errors like the Great Leap Forward could likely have been avoided, and the Cultural Revolution might not have happened. But what about Xi Jinping? It's the same situation. Think about it. The 3 years of pandemic prevention measures that just ended last year, especially the crazy measures in the last year, if it had been a collective leadership, would such crazy actions have been taken? Probably not, because at that time, many experts actually pointed out that such measures were wrong. If there were even an internal party decision-making mechanism, not necessarily a democratic one, but just a collective decision-making mechanism within the party, the probability of making such mistakes would be greatly reduced. Unfortunately, there is no such mechanism anymore, and no one can easily restrain it. As a result, you can see that on one hand, ordinary people are constantly doing nucleic acid tests in such a whirlwind of pandemic prevention measures. Endlessly struggling in this process is extremely painful. On the other hand, the entire decision-making mechanism is highly centralized. As long as he doesn't change his mind, no one can alter the direction of the country. A few days ago, the Ministry of Civil Affairs released China's civil affairs statistics for the 4th quarter of last year. One particularly interesting item in these statistics is that the column for the number of cremations in the fourth quarter is blank. The first 3 quarters all had data, but the fourth quarter did not. At that time, I was even planning to make this a topic, but I felt like I couldn't delve too deeply into it. Let's talk about this here. Why couldn't the death numbers for the fourth quarter be released? It's because the fourth quarter coincided with the first 1 or 2 months after the pandemic prevention measures were just lifted. Everyone still remembers when the National Health and Family Planning Commission used to announce the number of infections and deaths across the country every day. Later, after the death toll was revised once, it was said that over 50,000 people had died nationwide during that period due to the pandemic. But no one believed this data when it was released. The international scientific community generally estimates that the number is between 1 million and 2 million, because at that time, due to the medical system being overwhelmed, people couldn't buy medicine, and many people, after being infected, died from various complications related to the pandemic. So many people were looking forward to the Ministry of Civil Affairs releasing the death numbers for the fourth quarter to see if this data was significantly higher than the previous 3 quarters. Through that statistic, you could know the true number of deaths. However, this data is gone. It was not released. When I saw it at the time, I found it particularly interesting because the data from the Ministry of Civil Affairs is required to be accurate, and you can't just alter it arbitrarily. So perhaps the Ministry of Civil Affairs used this method to express their protest against such erroneous pandemic prevention measures. So why is this happening? Isn't it because China's current decision-making system is entirely dictated by one person? When he doesn't change, no one can alter the direction of the entire policy implementation. That's the first point. The second point, I think what Joe Biden said is also quite important, which is that when a dictator falls into absolute power, he inevitably enters a situation where he cannot recognize the true state of the country because no one dares to tell him the truth. The truth is often unpleasant to hear, and unpleasant truths might upset the dictator. If the dictator is upset, it could lead to unfavorable consequences for the person speaking the truth. So in the end, the result is that everyone will say nice things in front of him, things he likes to hear. Wasn't this exactly the case with Mao Zedong in his later years? Think about it. When we look at the Cultural Revolution today, that extremely absurd period lasted for 10 years, and we all find it unbelievable. But during Mao Zedong's era, no one dared to tell him that all of this was abnormal, and Mao Zedong was still immersed in his own belief that this was a great experiment to transform the country. What about Xi Jinping? Will he fall into this situation? I think he will. This is the loneliness of a ruler, the sorrow of a dictator. All dictators eventually fall into this kind of logic. It is necessary to protect the indispensable blood and fat of Demu.
Military needs, and relevant central departments.
So why is dictatorship itself so terrifying? It's precisely because of this. Actually, I think that generally speaking, Chinese people don't have such strong resistance to autocracy. Because of autocracy, like the Chinese Communist Party, in the past few decades, its economy has done quite well. People feel that although they cannot share power politically, it seems somewhat tolerable. However, dictators are especially intolerable. The reason is that once a dictator makes a mistake, they become extremely irrational. In other words, in today's Chinese political life, the dangers of dictatorship far exceed those of political autocracy. The third aspect is why, after Deng Xiaoping abolished the lifelong tenure system for leading cadres, this system was implemented for 30 to 40 years, and then everything came to an abrupt halt in the Xi Jinping era, returning to the era of dictatorship. I think the core reason is the entire institutional system of the Chinese Communist Party is not rigidly constrained. It is all soft constraints. For example, the practice of designating leaders across generations has never been a formal system. It is merely a tradition within their party. And this tradition itself can be abolished when faced with a strong political figure. Another more important point is that outside the Chinese Communist Party, there is actually a lack of constraints on the Chinese Communist Party's own power. You say this country has a constitution, but can this constitution restrain the Chinese Communist Party? It cannot. This country has courts, but can these courts restrain the Chinese Communist Party? They cannot either. So all the internal systems of the Chinese Communist Party depend on the power struggles within the party itself. When a political strongman emerges, the internal system of the Chinese Communist Party itself no longer has any binding force on him. Moreover, for a party like the Chinese Communist Party, how should I put it? It inherently has an autocratic nature. It has a tendency to admire strength, meaning it desires strong political leaders who can help them solve problems they believe are unsolvable. This is an intrinsic trait of the Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party itself carries a hereditary trait of dictatorship. So, after 40 years of this system, it has reverted back.
The old colleague is stepping down, and we need to seriously choose a successor. This is a long-term plan for the next 100 years. You are part of our strategic issue, and there are the state and the people and the party.
The plenary session accepted my request for retirement. I sincerely thank the plenary session and sincerely thank my comrades.
Finally, what I want to say is, yes, Mao Zedong implemented 30 years of dictatorial rule in China, and the disasters it brought to China's surveying and mapping institutions were extremely profound and painful. So what about Xi Jinping? What will he bring to China in the future? We don't know. But hopefully, he won't bring back the social disasters of the Mao Zedong era to Chinese society. Of course, we can only hope.
Become stronger, not weaker. Autocracy has grown, weaker, not stronger. Name me a world leader who would change places with Xi Jinping. Name me one. Name me one.
When certain remarks are extremely absurd and highly irresponsible, it constitutes an open political provocation.
How do you stand?
Kindness is essential.
The plenary session concluded. My request for retirement. I sincerely thank the entire Cadres, nation and my comrades.
No, it did not pass.
Do you think it would be appropriate for President Xi to serve several more terms after 5 years? Will this be a lifelong tenure? Will he rule for life? So do you think there are effective mechanisms to supervise and restrain this power, including President Xi's power?
This issue